My name is Josephine Connor. I live in Pawleys Island, South Carolina. I was 8 years old when my father went into the war. He was in the service approximately 9 months when he was killed on January 19th, 1945. I remember some of the time that he was in the war. Of course, we were all aware of the war and what was going on and so on, but as an 8-year-old, you really don't have too many concerns or any of that. But I think probably the most horrifying memory was the day I was walking home from school, and I was half a block away from my house, and I heard screaming. And that was the day the telegram was delivered. And that's probably the most painful memory I have, because all I remember were a bunch of very emotional Italians screaming and hollering. And I walked in, and they just screamed at me, "Your father was killed, your father was killed." The hurtful thing was that in those days, no one took you in their arms and tried to comfort you. I just became part of the group in the room, and from then on, it was a lot of crying and hysteria and so on. I guess for the most part, growing up, I thankfully was a survivor, and I was not an unhappy person, you know, especially loved going into high school and having fun and all of that. But I knew, I think particularly after I was married, I remember the day I was married, and I just broke into tears and said I miss my father, and it was probably the first time I admitted that. But that continued for a very long time. I just knew it was very difficult. I couldn't look at a war movie. I couldn't look at a flag. I cried at parades. There was always something missing in my heart. Now, we have to fast forward. Ironically, I lost my husband, my late husband, about the same time my mother lost my dad. So I was widowed with 3 children, just as my mother was widowed with 3 children. And ironically, my father's mother was widowed with 3 children. And we were all approximately the same age. I was 33 when my husband died. My mother was 34 when my father died. My grandmother was approximately 33 when her husband died. But anyway, so we're going to fast forward, and I'm now living here in South Carolina. My granddaughter, who's now 10, was born. My husband and I, my present husband, Ralph, and I were down in Atlanta and went down to visit the baby, and I was sitting home in our den, and it was Memorial Day, and all of a sudden I got hysterical, and my husband came in and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I miss my father." And something said, you've got to get answers, you have to find out what this is all about. And don't ask me what it was, but I just got hysterical. Ironically, the next day I picked up the Parade magazine, and I saw the familiar white cross that I had seen so many times from an overseas cemetery, and 2 women kneeling, and I said, uh-oh, this means something to me. And I flipped it open, and I start reading it. By the way, that was one section of the paper. I always waited until the last thing to read, but for some reason that day it was the first thing I read. And it was a story about a woman, Ann Mix, who was very much like myself, had lost her dad, and went overseas to see his grave and decided she needed to know about the war and so on. Well, I read the article, I picked up the phone, and I called Ann Mix out in Washington State and said, I'm an orphan too, and I need to find my father. We had decided, we had been given a wonderful opportunity by some friends in Pawleys that were going over to Paris for a month, and they were renting an apartment. And they said, well, if you'd like to come over for a week, and I said, yeah, right, Paris. Not one of the places I want to go. But then I thought, wait a minute. Paris is not far from Luxembourg, and that's what you'll do. So after talking to Ann Mix, she put me in touch with a woman in Luxembourg, Friends of the Veterans. Just picked up the phone and called Luxembourg and spoke to Renee Schlosinger is her name. And I said, I'm coming to Luxembourg to find my father. And she said, wonderful, I'll meet you at the train. my husband and I traveled to Luxembourg and met this woman who was wearing a baseball cap. And I don't even know if I can describe to you what the next 9 hours were like. This woman took me to where my dad was buried. As I entered the cemetery, of course, I had a meeting with the superintendent of the grounds there, and he talked to me about the cemetery and so on. And as my husband and I walked out to walk to my father's grave, they had planes flying overhead. They were playing the national anthem. I mean, it was totally unbelievable. It is a surreal experience. When I walked to my dad's cross, I knew it it was just like I knew exactly where it was. And incidentally, it's about 8 feet from General Patton's grave. You can't get a picture of my father's cross without General Patton's cross, gravesite. It was probably one of the days that have changed my life. And the only thing I remembered was I said to the superintendent of the grounds, I said, when you look at that cross, you now have a face. It's not just another cross. And the only thing I could think of to leave behind, because of course, you know, they discourage any kind of anything left at the cemetery. But I cut a tuck of my hair, a lock of my hair, and put it in the ground by my dad. But I definitely felt I made a connection that day. Spent the rest of the day with Renee, and I realized that as a person that lost her dad in the war, I didn't even know what the war was about or what they did. I just thought my father was there fighting. Nobody knew his name or what he was doing. And I can still see Renee showing me where the 94th Infantry Division traveled. And she said, if you come back, we'll walk in his footsteps. I have 2 brothers, that one is younger and one is older. The older brother, about 2 or 3 years, well, maybe 5 years before I went over for the first time, decided to go over by himself. Didn't tell anybody in the family he was going, he just went over. And when he went out to the gravesite, he collapsed. And the taxi driver saw what was going on and said, who is that? And he said, my father, and he stayed with him. Well, after my experience, I talked to my brothers and said, it's my wish that we all 3 go together. And we did. And ironically, we were there we were just left Luxembourg when 9/11 happened. By the time 9/11 happened, we were in Amsterdam. But we again went over. We were completely taken care of by the people of the Friends of Luxembourg. They cannot do enough for us. They take you into their homes. We slept there. They fed us. I mean, they do so much that you just don't know how to accept it. And it's like, enough, please, no, we don't need any more. And they said, you can't put your hand in your pocket. They tell us they will never forget that we freed them not once but twice, liberated them. I remembered so many things about what my mother said about him being killed in a castle and so on. And we found the castle. By that time, I had a lot of information and so on, and I did a lot of reading about the war in the Bulge. And I found the castle, and probably one of the tanks that my father shot at the day he was killed. We found the castle, and it is now a casino. And we went to that casino and took pictures. And I have copies of the book from the 94th Infantry Division. But anyway, so we had this wonderful, wonderful trip, my 2 brothers and my spouses and myself, and came back, and I decided to write to the newsletter, the A.W.O.N. newsletter, just to tell them what a wonderful experience we had and how wonderful the people of Luxembourg were. I just might mention, too, that during this course of time, I'd been to several conferences all over the country, in California, St. Louis, Washington, and so on, and had heard a lot of stories and did a lot of research. Well, anyway, so I wrote this note to to tell the people of the A.W.O.N. organization about our trip. just before, just before I went to Luxembourg the first time, they were having a conference in St. Louis, Missouri, and my husband and I went. And I spent 4 days in a hotel with hundreds of other orphans, and we had a lot of sharing circles and so many stories, and it was such a wonderful experience to know that there were others like you out there, because growing up you feel you're the only one. And when even when I left the airport and got into a cab and I saw the button on another woman, it's like, oh my God, you're like me. So the sharing circles, I mean, I could never have talked the way I'm talking to you now had I not done what I did, because for 4 days all I did was cry and never even stepped out of the hotel. You know, I guess the arches in St. Louis, I didn't see a thing. It was definitely concentrating on finding out about my father and talking to other people and sharing their stories. And I might add too that growing up, I think I blamed my mother for a lot of things, and we had a very volatile relationship, and I was critical because I thought, well, you know, she never really explained anything to me. She never comforted me. And there was a book at that time called Lost in the Victory, I believe, and Ann Mix wrote it, the lady I described as the founder of this organization. And there were a lot of stories from other war orphans. And the interesting thing is, after I read the book, I said, you know, my mother did a wonderful job. My mother raised us. We always had good food. She devoted herself completely to the 3 children. She kept a beautiful home. I had beautiful clothes. She managed well. Thankfully, I lived upstairs from one grandmother and across the street from the other grandmother. Luckily, I had 3 or 4 bachelor uncles that lived with the grandmothers and lots of aunts and uncles, and I was a part of a big family. And that's probably what got me through all of this. I realized when I read the book and talked to other war orphans that their lives weren't so great. A lot of their mothers were alcoholics. They were young. They had absolutely no idea how to raise a child or keep a house. I heard horror stories about, you know, the mothers that took the government pension and gave it to the stepdad to drink away, or gave the father's medals to the stepson, you know, and just kids that said that they had to raise their mother, because some of the mothers were 15, 16 years old and having babies, and they were clueless when it came to surviving on their own. I mean, it's not like today where there are so many places that you can go for help. These people were absolutely helpless and had no training, were not able to work. So it was a tough time for a lot of the war orphans, and I realized I didn't have it so bad. I had a lot of very good things about my life. My husband and I were sitting down to dinner one night, and the phone rang, and I answered it, and I heard, "Is this Josephine?" And when they start to stutter, I know where they're going. My last name, and I said, "Dolchemasklo, yes." And he said, "My name is Terry Botcher," and I recognized the name because he was one of the men that was in A.W.O.N with me at one of the conferences. And I said, "Yes," and I knew if he was calling me, there was a very definite reason. And he said, "I just read your note." And he said, "You were in Luxembourg and you were at the Berg Castle and so on." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "That's very interesting because I have a friend, I live in Des Moines, Iowa, and my buddy is Bruce Longstreet. And Bruce thinks he knows your dad." Well, I kept saying, I need to find someone that knew my father. Because my father was one of the replacement troops. Okay, so it was very difficult, you know. But when I heard this, I thought, I've completed my mission. He knows somebody that knew my dad. And he said, ironically, I was right behind you. I was in that area because where your father was killed, Bruce was there at that castle and was held prisoner of war. Well, within a few minutes, Bruce Longstreet was on the phone. Now, I had spent 7.5 years in Des Moines, Iowa with my late husband because he went to college there, and all of my sons were born there. Now, this man apparently lived just blocks from me at that time. Is that amazing? But anyway, Bruce Longstreet was on the phone, and he said, I knew your dad. We called him Dalsey because nobody could say Dolcemoscolo. And he said, we called him Dalsey, and he said he was known as Dad, you know, Pops, because he was 34 years old and had 3 children. Bruce was only 17. He told me a little story about how he was going to Paris gambling, or he needed money, and my father loaned him money, and after my dad died, he sent it to my mother. My mother didn't remember any of that, but that's how he remembered my dad. But he said, you know, he said, there's a lieutenant, oh, I'm sorry, his name escapes me, but I should know it. And he said, he lives in Iowa City, and I'm still in touch with him. Well, I recognize the name because I can remember as a child my mother reading that letter. He was the commanding officer at the time, and he wrote my mother and told her how my dad was killed. And he said, I'm going to get off the phone and call him, and he will be calling you. And there's also a man, and his name is Jim so-and-so in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And I said, well, I live in South Carolina. Well, anyway, within 2 days, I talked to 3 men that were with my dad when he was killed. And I'll share that with you. My dad apparently was in the castle, and he was looking out of the window. And it's funny because I'd heard this story since I was 8 years old. I mean, the same story came back. And he was shooting a bazooka, and there was a tank coming up, let's say on his right side, and he was shooting the bazooka. And another one came up on the left side and got him. He was the only man killed that day. But the Germans came in and took the rest of the squadron, and they became prisoners of war until the end of the war. Now, among the men were the lieutenant I just mentioned, Jim, and Bruce. Before long, I guess the next day, I got a phone call from the lieutenant, and I just can't remember his name, and I should. But there was so much emotion in his voice because he said, I can remember it like it was yesterday. And when we realized one of our men were killed, I said, oh no, no, don't let it be him. He has 3 little kids. That was a tough thing for him, and it was very tough when he had to write to my mother. Jim, the other gentleman that lives in North Carolina, my husband and I went up and had lunch with him one day, and his wife, and you know, he shared a few stories, but actually, this was wartime, and they really didn't have much time for socializing and getting to know each other, especially the replacement troops. But anyway, once that happened, I felt like I'd really accomplished what I set out for. What I needed to know was that my father did serve a purpose, to understand why he made the decision to go to war. Because my father was born in Italy. He came to this country when he was 11 years old, and he went back and fought his country, fought on his turf. And the only thing he said to my mother over and over again was, I'm fighting so that my children will be free. And when he decided, when he went into, he had a choice not to go to war. And he said, I couldn't leave the young kids, meaning the fellas that he was in boot training with. I was very resentful when I heard that. I said, well, he left us. He had no problem leaving his own 3 children. But when I experienced what I did in Luxembourg and Germany, I understood it more. And I realized that God bless the men of that generation. My father's name was Cosimo Dolcemoscolo, and he was a private. He was in the service 9 months before he was killed. I think he went overseas around probably August or September. I just remember my mother used to read his letters to us, and his nickname was Augie. And of course, all of the letters were censored. And, you know, very often they'd cut out and block out and so on. But he kind of got around that by saying, oh, I hear Augie is in Belgium. And he said, it's hell here. I mean, you know, apparently the fighting was fierce. I mean, and these are things I found out about how ill-equipped they were as far as it was the coldest winter they ever experienced in Europe, and some of the men were wearing summer uniforms and trekking through snow, and I mean, some of them. I mean, I knew people in the organization who, I mean, one man's body was frozen for days before it was even taken out of the fields. So there were so many horror stories that we didn't know about, and it was not an easy war. It stands for the American War Orphans Network. And I still belong to this organization. We still have conferences, and we have a listserv. I get an email, an accumulation of emails every day, and from other war orphans. I feel I have completed my journey. I really do. I think I've come to terms with my dad's death, and I understand it better. I feel I got to know my father a little better. And I feel I made the connection, particularly when I met the men that were with him, because the whole thing was, why was my father there? And did anybody know he was there? And I realized, yes, he served a purpose. And that's what I needed to know. And that's what I've accomplished. So I feel at my age, at this age of my life, I've got to move on and be thankful for what he did give me. And he gave me a lot. When my dad went into the service, we were living in Ossining, New York, and thankfully surrounded by family. Family was very, very important. We lived on a block with both grandmothers, with lots of aunts and uncles, and I think that's really what sustained us. I really do. And particularly my mother, because I can remember it had to be extremely difficult for her, and raising 3 children and worrying about, you know, in those days we had the kerosene stoves and and you couldn't get oil. You know, you had to practically beg the oil man to come and so on, and my mother could always give a sob story, you know, my husband's in the war, you gotta help me, you know. I mean, she was determined to keep everything running for us and so on. I can remember sitting around the kitchen stove at night and playing cards and trying to stay warm and so on. And there were times she'd say, I just have to get out of the house, I'm gonna go over and talk to Grandma. So thankfully she had a wonderful relationship with her mother and her sisters, and that was her escape, and that was her entertainment, and that was, you know, I mean, her support system. I don't know how any of us would have done it without that. It's just something that, I don't know, it just leaves such a hole in your heart when you lose your dad at that age, and it affects every minute of your life. And I'm just thankful that I was